I might start off and go through things today. So, not as a big change in things as we had last year with the budget, which affected a lot of superannuation and meant that a lot of people have had to do some changes along the way. And a lot of those changes only started on the 1st of July this year, so we're mainly just doing a few changes for people now. But fortunately this time they left superannuation alone, looked at other areas to put taxes on, like banks, and cut back expenditure. So we'll go through it now and we'll see what the major changes are. So the main thing was to try and make it a fairness budget. The government, as you know, has got problems in getting things through the Senate, so they're trying to make it as moderate as possible in any change that goes through in taxes. And so the only major one is going to be the Medicare levy, apart from the bank tax. But we'll look at the general revenue and where the money's spent and where the money comes from. So no surprise that basically 48% of the money comes from income tax, and that's a very high proportion compared to many other countries in the world. So the issue is that people who are working obviously pay a lot of tax, and then there's a few other tax like resource rent, superannuation is not very big. Taxes on superannuation is quite small, and a couple of others there, but there's no other major tax apart from the GST really, but the GST goes to the states, as you probably know, so it doesn't go to the Commonwealth at all. That's why the government looked at putting up the GST to 15%. The only problem is that they could get all the political difficulties of putting up the 15% tax, but they have to pass the money to the states, so why go there? So that was dropped. So basically the only other areas are sales tax, which is not very big at all. Big issue, of course, is we spend most of our money on social welfare, which is age pensions and things like New Start allowance and other benefits like there's widows allowances and things like that. Other areas, education, which is going to be more important in the future with the Gonski changes, and defence is a big ticket item there. So yeah, some bigger, probably roughly half our expenditures in social welfare. So there's your expenditure. The government spends around 25% of the total gross national product. So the Commonwealth government alone spends about $1.04 of total wealth that's produced each year in Australia. So they obviously tax it first and then pay it out in services and benefits. So the big one again, you can see the social welfare. That's just another pie chart of the same thing we saw before. So areas which are going to cost the government the most are things like social welfare. So the main thing is that the budget's created in the context of the economic environment. In boom times they can give money away, in bad times they still give money away because they say, well, you've got to re-inflate the economy. But overall the economy, whatever they spend their money on, can help the economy prosper. And if they can get their economic performance to improve, the wealth is created in society and they can then tax that wealth. So they're interested in keeping a sound economy. So the economy is pretty okay. It's not too hot, not too cold. We've got a moderate unemployment rate, about 5 to 6%, which is considered generally as being full employment. 95% of people being employed. Probably the biggest issue recently in the last few years is that you're getting a lot of part-time work coming through the workforce, not full-time work. A lot of people. The other issue is that there's still quite a high number of unemployed in the under 25s and under 30s, which is a common occurrence around the world now. A lot of European countries have sometimes up to 50% unemployment in the under 30s. So we're not alone there, but we don't have as much of a problem as some of the countries around the world. Biggest issue has been the overheating housing markets in Sydney and Melbourne, but overall the housing market slowed in most other cities. And the problem for Sydney and Melbourne, of course, is that roughly about a third of the population live in Sydney and Melbourne, with about 4 or 5 million people each, and that's two major markets where you've got booming house prices, which is distorting the rest of the economy because they're pushing out house prices there, whereas Perth's going down. Examples here, you can see Perth in the last few years after the resource boom have gone down quite a bit, probably 10 to 15%. Sydney's been booming, and Melbourne. So there's a potential that there might be a bit of a pullback in Sydney and Melbourne over the next few years, and Perth potentially go through a bit of improvement as the commodity prices improve. The big issue, though, that the government's worried about is that you'll get a decline in housing approvals, and that's going to then follow through into that blue-grey line, which will mean building activity will decline. So if you get building activity decline, it means there's less people who are building houses, there's less carpenters needed, electricians, plumbers, then Harvey Norman doesn't do as well, the banks don't do as well, because the building sector is a big driver of the economy. If you can get that going, it has a big ripple effect through many other parts of the economy, from, as I said, banking, retailing, and the building industry itself. So this is the worry for the government, seeing that decline in approvals. So they want to try and push that up if they can, or get the economy working in other areas. That is, and that's what one of their aims is. So there's been a reasonable recovery in the mining industry. Commodity prices have gone up a bit, not to the highs that we saw back in 2008 and 9. Reasonable recovery there. Iron ore and coal are the main ones. But the main issue is that that's helping the government, because a lot of the revenues coming into the government are from royalties, or they're from company tax. BHP, Rio, those sort of companies provide a lot of tax to the Commonwealth. So if we get commodities going, it also boosts the states like WA and Queensland, who are very resource dependent. Even New South Wales has a lot of exports through coal, and that'll help them as well. So commodity prices gained a bit of a recovery there, which is a good thing, because it went down quite substantially last year and had a big impact on the budget as far as revenues coming in. We've had a positive current account balance for the first time for many years. Now what that means is we've got a lot of these resources projects coming on stream now, exporting a lot of commodities, and that's adding to making our exports more than our imports, and that's a good thing. So that's going the right way. All this resource boom expenditure is now coming to fruition, but the problem we're finding is that we're not seeing the recovery in consumer spending. After the GFC being such a big dramatic event, people are not really getting back to the same spending pattern. So we're generally saving about 10% of our incomes. Before the GFC, we saved only about 1 to 2% of incomes on average. So there's been a major shift in our spending habits, which are now showing up in savings, which is all good, but it means the retail sector is subdued. Another factor in the retail sector is that you've got a lot of people buying things on the internet, and so it's not showing, sometimes this doesn't show up on the retail figures, because these are retail figures through bricks and mortar shops, whereas people now can get things on Amazon and get delivered through the mail. It doesn't show up on these figures either. So that's another reason why there's a bit subdued. But if you don't have retailing going very well, it means that you're not getting more revenue through GST, you're not getting this revenue through companies making profits like David Jones and Woolworths, and you're not getting revenue through wages and income taxes. So that's a bit of a down on the economy. But what we want to do is try and maintain this economic growth. If you keep the economy growing, the bigger the pie, the more the government gets their taxes from that revenue, and also everyone else is better off. So if you reduce your economic activity, you've got less production, you've got less wealth. So the aim of the budget is to partly to increase the wealth of the economy, and the big ticket item they've got here is to say they've got some good debt. They want to get some good debt out there, big infrastructure projects, 70 billion over the next 10 years. So this is a flagship for the government. They can go out and build railways and an airport. They can go out and look good on the TV, on the nightly news to show that they're actually doing something. And so that's going to be their big flagship aim, is to get the expenditure into these two major projects and others as well, but these two major projects can keep the economy going. So when there's a contraction in the building industry, in housing, these people who are carpenters, electricians and plumbers can again move into the commercial side of things in these sorts of projects. These sort of projects will need steel, they'll need concrete, they'll need trucks, all sorts of inputs into the building program, and that has a ripple through the economy, very similar to housing. Some difference, obviously. Harvey Norman won't do so well, but you know, people like Boral and Brambles and all these sort of companies that are associated with building projects, Lend-Lease, Leighton's, all will have a piece of the pie. So that's what they call good debt. Now, the issue is that what they've done here is saying that this is something they tried to promote, was the concept that if you look at good debt and bad debt, anything you spend on social welfare is bad debt, because in effect you're spending on something that you never get any benefit back from. That's not really true, but it's just a way of trying to promote this. They're spending money they're spending more money than they get in as revenue, but they're saying now that they want to have this debt to be put more back into things that are bricks and mortar and concrete. So they're saying things like social welfare doesn't produce wealth, health doesn't produce wealth, education, but they want to try and put the benefits into commercial projects. They're trying to get the deficit down. Every treasurer tries to do that. They've been not that successful. But reducing it down from around 3.75% of GDP, and now down to in last year was 2%, and this year they're projecting about 1.6. Now this is not too bad by international standards. A lot of countries are still running 3, 4 and 5% deficits overseas in Europe, and they haven't really got on top of their deficits either. We're actually doing not too bad in that case. At least it's coming down. But we've had roughly 10 years of deficits. Wayne Swan had a go, Joe Hockey had a go, and now Scott Morrison's having a go. But basically you can see along here some big deficits. The first one was 2009 and 10 after the GFC, $54 billion in deficit. These are actual figures now, 47 billion, 43. So Wayne Swan did bring it down a lot. He did a lot of clever accounting here. He brought forward revenue and deferred costs here to try and make that figure look good, and then they reappeared. All the lost revenue and the extra costs came up in the following year. Joe Hockey had a go, but he couldn't get it through the Senate, so the deficit's pretty high here. Has started to decline over time. In recent times, Scott Morrison was the one who actually brought in the changes on the age pension, cutting back the age pension assets test from 1.1 million in assets down to 856,000, so for a couple. So he was responsible for actually a reasonable, that was a major change in cost for the government, because it cut about 200,000 people off the age pension. And that's why he became basically promoted to Treasurer, because he was able to get that through the Senate. So the biggest problem is that the government wants to cut back, but they can't get it through the Senate. So these are all the history of where we're going to get into surplus in 2012 or 13. That was in 2012, we thought we'd be back into surplus. That didn't happen. Then there's a mid-year economic review. They projected it as surplus. Didn't happen. And so we keep recurring this, projecting it out, we're going to go back to surplus. Now, probably we won't even, the current projection is 2020, 21, but up here, I don't think that's going to happen, because you have to have we'll show you in a minute, but you have to have a pretty well, all the stars in alignment to get that, to get that projection coming, revenue going up and spending coming back, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So we've really been running deficit after deficit, not bad by international standards, but still running up a debt. And we call it a structural debt, where you've got recurring revenue you've got to spend, like aged care, aged pensions, new start allowances, all those are recurring revenue, payments to the states. So the red line is just saying that, the red line is saying that you've basically got a structural deficit in there that's contracting, but hopefully it'll eventually get back into a structural surplus. So some of the things that expenses of this budget are increasing the Gonski outlays, spending on apprenticeships, pharmaceutical benefits schemes going up, indexation of Medicare benefits, so that was where the doctors were on a freeze for their Medicare payments, and the National Rail Program starting up this year, where they're starting to getting the working out the Melbourne to Brisbane rail project. But the savings have been mainly from the increase in Medicare levy. That's projected for a couple of years' time. The major bank levy, that was the second biggest one. Of course, that's still being debated, but I think it'll still get through, even though the banks are not very happy with it. Uni fee increases and cuts to universities, and funding the families package, cutbacks there, and price cuts for medicines. So there's more savings than expenditures, so that's why it's cutting back the deficit. But overall, we're not too bad on actually our debt in accumulated terms. So if you look at the total debt we've got, we're not too bad. We're running about 20% of GDP in our total government debt in the Commonwealth. Bear in mind the states they run debts too, but not substantial. But you're looking here, Japan, Italy and France, they're running up around 80 to 100, over 100% GDP debt. Now, as long as interest rates stay low, they're okay, but they still keep running up debt each year. They don't seem stopping it. So,
Russell, is that public debt or total debt?
this is just public debt. This is doesn't include corporate debt, doesn't include personal debt. The difference in Europe, though, of course, is a lot of people don't own their homes, so they don't have a lot of personal debt, because most people rent in continental Europe. So it is a bit distorted by the fact that people don't have a lot of housing debt, whereas in Australia we've got a lot of housing debt. But this is just public debt. So places like France and Italy, because people don't have, well, they've run up a huge amount of debt, and they haven't cut back yet. They haven't got it in surplus. US, UK, same, Spain. So a lot of countries are double or triple what we've got in debt. So not in a serious situation now, but the credit agencies are saying, well, you keep promising to get the debt down to a surplus, and eventually they'll cut our AAA rating if we don't. But in relative terms, we're not too bad. It's not that far away from getting into surplus. If we could get things through the Senate, you could probably get it into surplus in 1 year. But anyway, that's the way the Senate is. Now, some of the a major announcement. This is an interesting one for people over 65, because over time we get a lot of people come in, usually when they're retiring, say, I'm thinking about reducing the size of my house, but the problem we find is that they've got to find a house that is cheaper, and the second thing is that they're often going to have less house and therefore going to have less space, and just at the time when you're going to be living in your house more, you're cutting back the space. So eventually people run around, look at the houses, and then decide, oh, I'll stay with the house I've already got because I've spent 20 or 30 years getting the way I want. I go around to another house, and then you find that's not really what you want, and then you defer that. So we don't really see people downsizing until they get the garden gets too much, or they find that they're going up and down stairs all day and they find that's too much. But generally it's more in your 70s and 80s that you're downsizing a house. So the government's trying to get people to do downsize, because it does release a lot of stock of housing. Now, most people who've come to Canberra in the 60s and 70s live in the inner area, and they really are living in a 3 and 4 bedroom home with only 2 people in it. Technically they're only using 1 bedroom when they've got 2 spare. Really that's a waste of those houses. So you really should, people like that probably are better off to move, say to Gungahlin or to Tuggeranong, if they really wanted to downsize, because they don't really need a house close into the city. technically what we should be happening is people who are working and should be closer to the major city so that they can get to work. People who are retired are not travelling into the city every day because they're not working there. So that's just a theory that if you release those houses, it goes to people who are closer to their work. The basic concept here is to give them incentives. So they're saying if you've got a large house and you downsize, you can put up to $300,000 of what's left over into superannuation as long as you're under age 75. And that's not a bad concept because they've got a $1.6 million cap on superannuation. So you can still put your money into super if you're over that $1.6 million cap. So that's a bit of a relief for people who've got, say, $1 million house and wanted to go down to a $500,000 property. But for a lot of people in Canberra, their houses are around the $500,000 to $600,000 mark. To go down and get a substantial downsize, you'd have to probably go down to a $350,000 house, and that's a big drop in the quality of housing. Sorry, Rob.
Is there any stamp duty relief proposed?
Glad you asked that question. Yes, there's stamp duty relief in the ACT. I'll come to that, but it's so basically I'm just going back on following that point. If you've got money in super, you're taxed at 15%. Now the benefit of that is if you're on a comp super pension, most people are on the 24 or 39 cents tax bracket. It is a benefit to get it back into super if you can. If your income's less than 18,000, it's not much benefit going to super because you're taxed at 15%. You're actually best to keep it out of super. So it's a bit of a complex issue, depending on your tax rates, whether you actually put that money into super or keep it outside of super in an investment trust. But that's something you really need to come to me and work out which is the best way to go. If you want to go to pension phase, there's no tax inside the super and no tax on your drawings, but it depends on whether you need that income. So putting the $300,000 into super is a good idea, yes, for some people on middle or high tax brackets, but not everyone. So I said, yes, you can move to pension phase where you pay no tax, but you may not want the income, so depending on the situation. If you're on an age pension, putting it into super doesn't give you any benefits these days because it's assessed exactly the same as if it was in your bank account or an investment fund in your own name. So you don't get any benefit from the age pension side, but you're getting a benefit on the tax side. The big issue in Canberra is that you get a benefit on the stamp duty. People who are on an age pension in Canberra can get a move into a house that's less than $661,000 with a stamp duty of just $20. So that's probably the biggest incentive on this side of things. But you've got to be on an age pension to get it. So that's not bad. It varies from $661,000 to $860,000. You've got a phase in where you do pay stamp duty, and the stamp duty is at $16 per thousand. So there is a big incentive on the stamp duty side because that's one of the big costs you've got in moving is the stamp duty. And this is to give an example of stamp duty on is a bit unrealistic in Canberra, a $2 million home. We're one of the highest stamp duty rates in Australia because with stamp duty it gets more expensive as you go up the scale. The cheaper homes are around about 4% stamp duty. So around the $400,000 to $500,000 mark, you only pay about 4%. But the people who are on a $2 million home pay on average of 5.25%. So that's about over $100,000 for a $2 million home. So yeah, $105,000. So we're pretty expensive on the stamp duty. So if you can get that concession, pretty good. But you've got to get the age pension to be able to get it. So this is just an example of if you went from a $3 million home, a bit unrealistic, but to a $2 million home. In this example, it's costing you around $200,000 to change the keys on the key ring. They're a bit unrealistic here. They put down $30,000 for advertising, $45,000 for real estate agent. Most real estate agents, I wouldn't think, be charging that much, but who knows. Preparation of the property, storage items, removals. Big cost here on this side, of course, is stamp duty, the $100,000. So if you can save that, well, you'd be good, but you'd have to not be getting an age pension. They still have to be getting an age pension to get the stamp duty concession in the ACT. This one's an interesting one. First home savers, there's a lot of pressure on the government to give some incentive to first home buyers. In the past, they used to give you a grant, which of $7,000 or $14,000. Currently, it's only for new properties. But they've found the problem with that, it inflates the price of properties, because what people do is can borrow more money, and therefore it lifts the price of property. So it's actually self-defeating doing that, and it was a silly idea. Well, it's a silly concept, but of course everyone says, well, it's a good idea because you're giving somebody money to buy a house. This concept, though, is using superannuation. So you're allowed to put up to $30,000 over a lifetime into superannuation as salary sacrifice. So you've got to go back to your employer and say, I want to have my wages put into superannuation and dedicated to that superannuation account. So all the super funds hopefully will open these accounts for you. So it's a segregated category. As you put your salary sacrifice in, it's going to be basically categorised in that category, and you can only put up to $30,000. Now, when you do want to buy a house, then you can access it. So this is the only time until you're 55 that you can access money out of super unless you die. So, better way than dying, so getting money out of super, so it's not a bad way of doing it. But the main thing is if you have a couple, they can put in $30,000 each, and then they can draw that $60,000 out for a property. And if you're using a 10% deposit, well then if you can buy up to a $500,000, $40,000 home. So you can borrow, if you can borrow, basically borrow around $40,000 and then get your property. So that gives a chance for people in Sydney and Melbourne who are paying on average about $600,000 to $700,000 for a property, even for apartments in that sort of league. So it gives a chance for even people in Sydney and Melbourne to get back into the market. But they've got to save it, so it'll take them probably 1 or 2 years to save that, because when you're a first-home buyer, you're not on the top income, you're probably in the $50,000 or $60,000, $70,000 income bracket, so you're only going to save roughly 34 cents tax on going in, but you lose 15% as it gets in. So you save 34 to 39 cents on your marginal tax rate on your wages, but you lose 15%. But
Russell, when they draw it out to pay the deposit, is it taxed on the way out?
No, it's
Right.
only taxed as it goes in.
Because I thought I heard somebody say it's taxed on your marginal rate on the way out.
No, that would be self-defeating. You might as well just take it.
That's what I thought.
No, that's not right.
Right.
So if you're on the top marginal tax rate, you could save about 26. The benefit in saving is 26,000, so that's quite good. But for most people, they're not on top marginal rate. So if you're on 34 cents, which is probably, well, that's people up to $87,000 income, you're going to be able to have a net saving of $15,000 on your tax. So that's a reasonably good help for those people looking for buying a house. And so that gets a lot more people into the market, but they've got to save for it too. So it helps when they go off the bank, because the bank says, the banks now require people to show that they've got a savings history, and now they can show it going into a super fund. That's a tax benefit for them. It shows they're putting their money before they get it straight into a super fund, and it's going to be a disciplined approach for people to get their savings together. So not a bad concept. The only argument is that it's actually just adding more fuel to the fire, that you've got more money coming in into the housing sector to push it up. But it's going to take 1 or 2 years at least for people to save this, I reckon. And the consequence is it delays the demand for a couple of years until potentially house prices do come off a bit. Marginal tax rates are unchanged, so there's no change there. Last year they went from, they changed the tax rates for people on 80 to 87,000. They dropped them back to 34 cents rather than 39 cents. So they did a bit last year. The government's already saying next year they'll probably look at try and get some tax cuts next year because it's election year. So we'll see what happens there. But they obviously brought in this concept of, they brought in the 2.5% Medicare levy. That's coming in a couple of years' time. But they dropped the 2% budget levy, repair levy, which was has been in for the last 3 years. So just to give you an idea, many years ago, people don't remember this, but there used to be a 61 cents tax bracket in Australia, going back in the early 80s. So that was pretty punitive. Paul Keating said that was too punitive, and he's the one out there now saying that the Labor Party shouldn't bring back the 49 cents tax bracket. He's saying what he's saying here, 49 cents tax means that for every 2 days you work 1 day for the government, which is a pretty, which is a pretty interesting concept, because you're effectively you're working only half yourself. Over here, he was the one, sorry, go back here. He was the one, Paul Keating was the one who actually dropped this tax from 61 down to 40 or 49, I think it was. So he was really an architect of bringing tax brackets down. But you can see here the tax bracket's been jumping up and down. There was a 47 cents tax, now it's 47.5. So that's gone back to normal. Residential property investors now can't claim their travel expenses, so and also depreciation allowances. So we'll talk about that. That was one that's shocked people. I think they got surprised because people were going on their holidays to their holiday home and claiming it's a tax deduction. So bit of I think it's unfair, because people were effectively getting a tax deduction or getting a tax loss to pay them to go for holidays. But it might change the way people invest in Queensland now, or down the coast. So as I say, it's really tax loss paying for your holidays. The other one is depreciation allowances. People were getting quantity surveyors to go out, when they bought a property, investment property, go out and go through and work out depreciation allowances on stoves, carpets, curtains, light fittings, and then they'd come back to the accountant and say, yes, these are the depreciation allowances on all these. They could then claim it straight away. But of course you weren't spending any money, you were just getting a depreciation allowance, which then the tax office gave you a refund. So the tax office say, well, this is a bit unfair, we're just paying you just for you bought a property, an old property, we're not going to give you that refund anymore. You can only claim what you actually spent, but it does mean that you're actually you can claim the whole lot. So you buy a new stove for $500, well, yes, you can claim the whole lot in that year, rather than claiming it over 5 or 10 years. So there's a bit of pros and cons there. It saves accountants mulling over depreciation schedules each year and getting a declining balance claim.
What about the infrastructure replacement? Because that's something that...
Well, that's a capital item.
40.
Yeah, that's right. So
that's still the case?
Still the case, that's okay. What we're referring to is you still get the 2.5% depreciation on the capital value of your property. Yeah. This is just, these are fixtures and fittings, which is carpets, curtains, lighting fittings, anything that's, that's not part of the physical part of the property.
And when's that effective from?
One in July.
So that will mean any leftover, so monies we've spent before, that we only got, say, a proportion of it, all of that will come in from 1 July?
You don't get that depreciation allowance next year.
No, but the amounts you didn't claim as tax deductions because it was over so many years.
Yep.
But you bought another last year.
Yep.
And you only got to claim a fifth or something. So all the rest of it, the other 80%.
You can't claim.
We can't claim that in the under the new scheme.
No, that's my understanding. So, but if you spend it on a new fridge next year, or whatever, yes, you claim the whole lot. So, a bit of a different major change. As you say, people are going to get caught in the middle of that.
Isn't it when you bought the property? If you bought the property prior to budget night, you can carry on.
Oh, sorry, it might be that. Yeah, it might be that. Right. Yeah.
It's only if you buy property
after that time. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's right. But new properties, you can still claim it on new properties.
And this has to get through first.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's right. So you can, but if it's new properties, you can still claim a deduction. Gives incentives to buy investors to buy new properties. Now, the reason why that's a good incentive is because the problem is we've got a shortage of supply of housing. I mean, just alone, we bring in about 250,000 new migrants each year. So if you look at that, we probably need 50 to 80,000 houses just for those people coming in. So we have a problem of supply, and if you can get investors to buy new properties rather than old properties, well, it does create demand for new properties, it creates more supply. Company tax, over time we've been in the process of reducing company tax, so that's already started. Last year it was 28.5%, now it's down to 27.5% for small companies, for small businesses. It's got to be a company, a trust, so trusts don't get benefit of this, but it reduces the tax you pay. For people here, it really is not much of benefit because you don't get as much franking credits back. Now, for most ASX companies, that's not going to be a problem because they usually are paying full franking credits, and they've got more than $10 million worth of revenue, so it's not going to affect them. But it's going to affect people who are getting franking credits coming in for those people and using them to reduce their tax. Eventually it's going to be for companies up to $50 million, down to 25%, but it's going to be a 10-year process to get that down. It's a bit, just to show you, where is it? Pretty graphic, no, it's not there. But in most OECD countries, they have a lot lower tax brackets, rates than we do. So that's, we're still way out of line as far as, I've got a graph on that later on, so I'll come back to that. But most OECD countries have a lot lower tax on companies. The UK is about 17%. US is the only standout there, 35% still, and Trump wants to bring that down to 15 to 20%. So Australia's sitting at around 27 to 30. It's still very out of line with the rest of the world. Singapore's like 15%. So company taxes, because we're competing for capital around the world, if you've got a very high tax rate, they'll say, well, why should you go to Australia? You've got less chance of making profits, well, keeping your profits if you're going to pay more tax. So they prefer to go to a low tax country to invest because they'll keep more of the profits. And if you're competing with capital around the world, if you don't get that capital, you don't get investors coming into Australia. So the real impact is on franking credits, as I said. If you've got reduced the franking credits you're going to get, and for those people who are on, say, 19 cents tax bracket, they won't get a refund as much. If you're on if you've got a low income or no income that's taxable, you just get less franking credits. So, but you're going to get more income because you got less. It's got more profits. So the net effect is it's actually doesn't really make much difference. And as I said before, the people, any of the ASX 300 companies, you won't find any company in the US, in Australia that's only having $10 million turnover in the ASX 300. So it won't affect your investments as far as a lower tax rate. $20,000 write-off for plant equipment, that's really just an incentive to get business to spend money and grow the businesses. That's going to be continued on. They're going to cut it out this year. So I'll go to 2016, 17, 18. So that's all good to create more jobs. Extension of the liquid asset test. Now this one's probably not going to affect too many people here, but it's really about New Start and youth allowance. Probably one that I don't think is going to get through because currently it's 13 weeks, and if you've got if you're a single person, you've got to have less than $5,000 in the bank to avoid the liquid assets test. So what does it mean? If you've got $5,000 or less in the bank, you'll get your New Start allowance or sickness allowances straight away. Well, you have to be pretty poor to have less than $5,000 in the bank, or other investments, so shares or property or anything else. For a couple, it's $10,000. Now, you've got a lot. If you've got more than say $10,000 in the bank, you've got to last 13 weeks. Let's say you had $11,000 in the bank. Well, now you've got to last 26 weeks because that's what they're saying. It's going to take you 6 months to get your payment. So I think that the threshold's too low. They probably may have to raise this, and it's obviously got to go through the Senate. So it'll probably be knocked on the head and changed around. But it seems a bit harsh for people who've got very low cash balances to live on $10,000, $11,000 or more for 6 months. New Start activity test for people over 55. Just saying that once you're 55 to 59, it's very hard to get a job, so they're making the activity test a little bit easier by only doing half the activity requirements. And if you're 60 to to 60 to 65, you only have to do 10 hours per fortnight of volunteer work or activity. So infrastructure, this is the big ticket item, spending money, it's good debt, so therefore you can spend it, and creating infrastructure for the regions. So the government's been put into the concept of building, or pushed into the concept of building a Melbourne-Brisbane railway, because the National Party likes the concept, because they can show that they're doing something for the regions, because it goes through a lot of electorates all through the country regions into Brisbane. It's going to be a major project because the areas around Brisbane have to have a lot of tunnels, so there's going to be a lot of money spent up there. They're saying 10 billion, some people say 15 billion in real terms because they don't really know, but that's going to have to be a huge project. Not too bad. They'll probably actually take the line from Cootamundra or Junee, because there's a dual, the railway was duplicated from Melbourne to Albury. It's only single line, single track from Albury to Junee, but they'll probably make that duplicated and then take the rail link from there. The main thing with rail is you don't want to go through hills because it costs you a lot of money and it makes it difficult for trains. So they'll be heading out all through the fat regions of New South Wales. It's only when they get to close to Brisbane, to Ngavia and places where they have to start tunnelling. But the big issue for them is that they want to have double stacked rail cars. So you probably know across the Nullarbor they do double stacking. So the problem there you've got to have is you've got to be able to get on the bridges. So they've got to be able to get all the bridges from, say, Junee all the way through to Brisbane with higher height requirements. And then if they're going to go through tunnels, they're going to have a much higher tunnel requirement. So it's going to be a pretty big project. But if you double stack things, you don't need as long a train, and it just gets there quicker. But yeah, so that's a big project. It's going to probably take, I don't know, 5 or 7 years or something to get going. The airport we know about, the Badgerys Creek, well, that's a big project, and it's going to be government owned, and obviously that will take a while to do. They expect next year to start the first activity on the site, but that's all about getting activity going, because the housing sector is slowing and the resource boom infrastructure is all come down quite a lot. So they're really trying to replace that activity. So it'll keep things going for a few years, and it's good debt, but it's generally a good thing to have new infrastructure projects coming into the system. So the Medicare levy, which is obviously the Labor Party says, oh no, that's they agree with the Medicare levy, but they just want the rich to pay. So there's going to be an argument about that, depending on the crossbenchers will probably, whether they argue about whether that'll get through. But you pay the Medicare levy from $21,000. So probably what will happen here is they'll say that's probably a bit too low and may raise the Medicare levy to get it through. So you've got Matthias Cormann, who does a lot of the negotiation on this through the Senate. So he's been very successful in negotiating a lot of the changes, getting a lot of the legislation through. I expect this is going to be one of those ones where you get a negotiation, and I eventually think it'll get through. It was actually a bit of a poison chalice that the Gillard government left, because they promised all this spending, but they never had it funded. They just said, oh, well, we won't be in government at that time to worry about, so we'll promise it. But you know, Scott Morrison, you know, to his word, is now wanting to fund that and make it work. And it's obviously a couple of years' time before the big costs come into that. And this is where it's coming in. That currently it's about $10 to $12 billion worth of spending, going up to 18 billion in the next 10 years. So there's a real 50% incline in the amount of spending there, and that's got to be funded. And it's roughly about $5 or $6 million worth of new revenue they've got to find. Pension concession card, this is probably the biggest one that will affect most people, is getting the concession card back for those people who lost the age pension last year, and because they were over the assets test. So you'll obviously get the pharmaceuticals, but that was, you could get the pharmaceuticals, you get the pharmaceuticals from the Cedars Health card, but now you'll get all the rates, gas, electricity, driver's licence, rego, and all those things back. So that's probably a couple of $1,000 in benefits to you. So they'll be just reissued. I understand the government just, for everyone who lost their benefit, they'll just get an automatic card in the mail. They haven't said when, but it'll probably take a while. So we know we'll give you some good discounts there. Leave you with this thought. This is something that's to give you an idea the problems of governments in the future. Why do we want to get the deficit down? Why do we want to get surpluses? Is because we know that there's an ageing population. We know that currently there's about 5 to 6 people in employment for every person retired. The biggest issue for the government is the next 20 years, it'll go down about 3 people in the workforce for every one retired. So who's going to fund all that? Well, there's only really the workers who can fund it. So this is a table showing all the different countries in the world, how much, if we looked at just using our own savings, how many years could we last on average? So if you look at the total pool of superannuation in Australia and life expectancy, which Australia's got one of the highest life expectancies in the world. I haven't got Japan in here. Japan's got the highest. So the basic story says that an average person is going to live 21 years in retirement. If you looked at the total pool of superannuation in Australia, an average person will only last 11 years if you didn't have government support. So the government's really got to finance the other half. And that's what roughly happens in Australia, is that most people get around a half to 2/3 their incomes from the government. Now that's currently the situation, but if the government doesn't have the money, how are we going to get that stretch? Well, it just means you've got to live shorter, or you're going to have to live on less. So I'm not sure which one you want to choose. But anyway, so the key thing here is that many other countries in the world have got the same problem. India doesn't have the same problem because you've got short life expectancy. But anyway, but the key thing is when you've got high life expectancy, yeah, you've got to make your money stretch longer. So what I'm saying is that government's fritting away each year 2 to 3, 4% GDP deficits. We should be making surpluses now for the next 20 years when people are retired and the government's going to have a big demand on their revenue. That's my thought with that graph. It just tells us we should be putting more away. But as I said, they're hard to get through the Senate. People want more. Everything. Governments want. The population always wants more and have less tax. So there's no major tax increases. There's a little bit of intransigence, as I said, from the Senate to try and get things changed. And the government's now saying, well, if we're going to try and stay in power, we're going to have to promote the excess spending by way of making it look like good debt. And that's what they're calling it. So now they've broken up all their expenditure into good and bad debt,